my research project was done on juvenile justice reforms. The guide to the presentation will start with a little introduction, then we'll go on to the literature review, which will be the most large, in-depth part. Then we'll go on to my methods of interviewing for the research project, along with the analysis of the interviews and the literature I read. We'll go to conclusions based on all these findings put together, along with the implications and the future research that these things will apply to and can be done with. And we'll finish by looking at all the references I had. For the introductions, the purpose of my study is to look at rehabilitation over incarceration in juvenile justice specifically, because it is an area where it's important, and we'll get into the reasons why as we continue. And a lot of youths are put in detention centers and juvenile prisons, and they are youths, and some of them are simple mistakes, and not many of the crimes are incredibly serious. So we've got to start with how juvenile justice was introduced, and it started in the 19th century with the progressive era, where we started to see first child labor rights, because before this you had children working jobs at young ages like 11, 12 that we would consider adult jobs, and in factories and all these things. You always hear about how the children, the little girls would work in the weaving factories and spools because they could get their hands in there where an adult couldn't. And so this started with an opposition to child labor, and it led to more free time to do things, and they started to see children do more sort of what you'd call delinquent activities. But this also introduced the idea that children were different than adults and should be treated differently, and that's where juvenile justice started to occur and shifted from children just being treated like adults. Now they're treated as children and juveniles. And in 1899, the first juvenile court opened in Chicago, Illinois, and Cook County, and many followed. And it basically took on specifically juveniles' cases rather than everybody else's. And the idea for juvenile justice was parens patriae, and that means that the government takes over parents if they can't do their job, and this is like custody, but it also applied to punishment. Previous to this, it was the parents would punish the children for any wrongdoing, but now it was the government's job to step in and punish juveniles for something that they did wrong. And the problems with this early form of juvenile justice and its occurrence was that it focused completely on rehabilitation. And you might think this is a good thing, this is what I'm advocating for, but it was a different concept of what would be known as rehabilitation. Instead, it was rehabilitation to function as getting them ready for adulthood, rather than rehabilitation as let's get them in a program or let's do something so they don't do it again. It was let's rehabilitate them by getting them more ready to work in a factory or more ready to go somewhere and do a job, rather than actually stopping them from doing more things and committing another crime of whatever sort they did. It didn't focus on the actual issues of the kids, and this was a big issue. It also focused on the impoverished and had a racial bias, as the racial bias is something that you see a lot, especially earlier as the country was developing, sadly. And the impoverished part is if you were rich and you committed a crime at this time, it was easy for your parents to pay the judge or pay somebody and know somebody, and you would get your out of it with nothing really happening to you, whereas those who couldn't afford to got hurt because of this. And there weren't rules, there wasn't precedent, it was broad, and there were no restrictions as to how the judges could rule. So this caused many different results depending on where you were, and there was no sort of system to it. There was no, even though judges have a certain discretion, there was no system to it, there was no setup to it, and it was chaos. The second wave of juvenile justice we call the due process wave, and it started in the 60s. So we've got from sort of the late 1800s to the 1960s is the first wave, and now we're in the second wave, and started with the case of Kent v. United States. and this was a case that granted due process rights to youths in court cases, because previously they didn't necessarily have any that were enumerated, so it wasn't said they have them. In some cases they may have, some cases they may not have, but now they were given it. And it was specifically, though, whenever they were treating as adults. So even though they were a youth, they didn't have it yet. So it was, again, we're seeing a progression. This is a slow progression towards the modern day. And the case of In Regalt in 1977 was one that established due process rights for the youth. So again, shortly after, we're starting to see this wave towards more rights for the youths and more things, whereas the previous one was, well, they're considered children and we treat them differently. This one's, well, what should we do about treating them differently and how should we approach it? It looked at things a little more. But it wasn't a very large wave, it was very short, as we'll see. With Wave 3, we had the Get Tough on Crime era, and Wave 3, which started in the late 70s. So that second wave was a very quick and passing one that you could implement into either the second or the first or the third, but it's considered a second one, but it's not a big one that we look at. And it started due to an increase in juvenile crime, and the reports were accurate. There was an increase. However, it was sensationalized by the news, and this would be compared to some cases, the crime being sensationalized in the current day, even though statistics show it's decreased. And the problem was this sensationalization and everything, it was heavily slanted towards black youth and black Americans. So again, we see another racial component still occurring in the juvenile system, and it started to treat more youths as adults, and they would go with more severe punishments. And this is where we see sort of mass incarceration in juvenile detention centers of the youths over rehabilitation. And because of this, there was a lack of teen courts being used and more options. And we saw when youths went into that system of being treated as an adult, they would recidivize and they would commit more crimes, and they would go down a pathway of committing more crime and doing more serious crimes. And this leads us into the fourth wave, and what would be considered the current wave, though there is some idea of updating it to a sort of fifth wave, but it'd be again that second wave where, like, we don't know how it will shift quite yet. But the fourth wave starts in the early 2000s, and it starts around 2005 with a case we can put to and say Roper v. Simmons, which basically it resulted in them to allow research on youth specifically about the impact of a serious punishment and how that can negatively affect youth outcomes. Previous to this, there were some studies, but there were not many. This is where we start to get a lot of studies about juveniles and juvenile justice reform. And the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Act, which had passed in the 1970s, that was more harsh, but again, it gave some rights to juveniles and basically separated them from children to adults. It was updated in 2002 and gave them more rights, and basically said that children and adults had to be separated, and that they, in certain crimes where they weren't statutory, they wouldn't be put on their record, and it would allow the youth to, again, continue. So we start to see more reforms and stuff, especially in the earlies. But as, again, we start to develop a different system, and it looked basically like, let's do rehabilitation. This is where rehabilitation became a big thing, and it looked for youths who were low risk of committing another crime and a high likelihood to be able to reform and change. And it basically said, we don't need to have a long trial that you wait months for. We need to speed up the teen courts so that way we can get them out so they're not stuck in prisons and jails and detention centers, because that's harmful to the youth. And so we started to look at an increase in community service and other forms similar to community service as a punishment, with like a sort of probationary check-in, but again, not as necessarily serious depending on the crime. And this is where we start to see what you would introduce as a possible fifth wave. It hasn't been called that quite yet, with the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018, that it changed, and it was a completely new act that separated youth from adults in more cases, which basically meant it was easier for youths to be treated as youths in certain crimes, and protections against VCOs, which basically again meant that if you committed a crime that isn't as serious, you can get it expunged from your record, or that if it was a little more serious, it would be hidden from your record, and so that way it wouldn't ruin your future prospects. And it specifically mentioned start to look at the racial discrimination and the biases in the youth justice system, because as with the previous ones, there's a large case of racial bias and poverty involved in that. And this basically said, we want you and we will fund you to investigate why this is and how we can solve it. And now we'll get into a little more about that. And so for my interviews, I interviewed Tanisha Pruitt, who is a state policy fellow at Policy Matters Ohio, which is a nonprofit progressive research foundation that looks into juvenile justice and other progressive forms with homelessness and everything. And then I also interviewed Takasha Smith, who is an executive director at the Juvenile Justice Commission, which is a national advisory group. So basically they aren't an official group of the government, but they advise the government and local states about bills and stuff they can pass, and advising in juvenile justice more specifically. And both in my interviews were done over the phone, and we had great discussions, and the communication leading up to the phone calls was done through email, and that's how I explained the research project itself and got their consent, and I emailed them the form and they emailed me back it signed, and we then proceeded to have the phone calls. And I took notes of the interviews by asking them and recording the phone calls so I could transcribe it later, so that way I could review it. And I analyzed these transcriptions by looking at them, and I took each of the questions I asked that were relating to juvenile justice, and I got the answer, and I separated it out in a table that said answer from Takasha, answer from Tanisha, and I put them both down in each answer separately to each question because I asked them the same questions. And then I looked at the literature I had read, and I compared all those and found the big points that were similar and some contrasting ones. And then I continued. And so we get to the analysis where we want to look at what the interviews resulted in. In both interviews and the research, I found it was a big emphasis on preventing youths from going into juvenile prisons and adult prisons in general, and getting them out and getting youths who are already in it out of those prisons and out of those systems, because it was shown to be detrimental. And again, the research showed that less serious punishments that were still adequate, but not like going to a prison or being incarcerated and looking towards reform instead, resulted in a less crime and less recidivism from the people. It showed that when you put them into a system like that where they're taken out from their environment and they've got nowhere else to be, it resulted in more cases of them going deeper into that system and becoming more involved in it and stuck in it. And then this is similar to it, but rehabilitation and diversion programs and community service specifically to prevent crimes. And diversion programs were shown in the research to be 92.8% of the people who participate in diversion programs after being arrested and tried of a small crime, and they were eligible for record expungement, which again meant that their future prospects wouldn't be ruined. Another thing that was similar is both found the approach of using positive outcomes at home and individuals with youth to impact, and this basically was agreed with by the research that the people in your life are going to affect you, and if you've got more positive people surrounding you, you're going to have a more positive outcome in both preventing you from committing crimes, and once you've committed crimes, from reforming and not recommitting another crime and going back into the system as well. Both found that accessibility was a difficult issue because, again, it's youth, so depending on the age and family, they may not have a vehicle to go to meetings, they may not have a vehicle to go to programs, and the public transport in the United States isn't great, so it makes it hard, and it's supportive from the parents who are busy with jobs and maybe not able to take the youth, so it leaves a lot on the youth who possibly can't do much to go to the diversion program. And in contrast, both found things that they would want to be changed immediately. I found this the most interesting contrasting point because many of the points were just similar things, maybe a different wording, but this was a big contrasting point they had, was the things they wanted. One wanted more funding. The immediate thing was, we want more funding so we can support programs and everything and help the kids and everything and stop them. And because it's money is always helpful. Whereas the other said they wanted a greater empathy and understanding from people about the plight of the youth and how the youth aren't bad even if they commit a crime, and there's so many other factors that lead up to it, such as poverty, wealth, parents, outcomes like we mentioned, and that they want people to look at it as less like, oh, the youth is evil for doing something, that instead they should be treated with as a youth who's still developing, and they should be given a chance to reform and learn from their mistakes. That was the biggest difference I found, and again, I'm sure both would support either one if you mentioned it to them, but I found this interesting that that was the first thing they thought of when asked what the first thing they would change or adapt or help people see was. And from all this, the research, including the interview and the literature and the reading, we can take some big points from it of things that we can do to aid the juvenile justice system and juvenile reform to create a positive change. And that's a focus on rehabilitation over incarceration. This is the biggest point that you can remember. Rehabilitation over incarceration, because incarceration leads them to going deeper in the system and getting stuck in it, whereas rehabilitation presents the opportunity for youth who is still developing to get out of the system, to learn from their mistakes, and to recommit to doing something better and to having a better life. Funding is always a need. Anywhere you'd always want more money. Nobody wants to not have more money. Diversion programs and community service options are important because these are things that help keep the youths out of committing crimes and from committing crimes again once they've done a crime, because these things have shown to help them and distract them. It gives them something to do so they're not bored enough to commit a crime, because many youths don't need to commit a crime to get something. Not on the record expungement, so that way this is important because it doesn't mess up the future of the youth who committed a non-serious crime and didn't deserve to have his future ruined for something he made when he's a kid and developing. And again, these things focus on less serious to mid-serious crimes, so we're not looking at saying, hey, you committed a murder, you shouldn't be incarcerated. It's, oh, you maybe robbed a store because you and your friends were bored, you had the money to pay for it, but it just sort of happened, but nobody was hurt, you only took some money, maybe some items. That's not so serious that we need to lock you up. Instead, there are other punishments available. And this, don't repeat past mistakes. With the different waves, you could see a cycle where we were very immediately progressive, and then we went to, again in the third wave, being very unprogressive, very hard on crime. And it's, don't repeat the mistakes of being hard on crime. Don't get locked into a narrative that, oh, youths are committing crime, we need to lock them up. Stay with rehabilitation because it's shown to be the better option through the research. And again, some of what we'll see in my next slide is continuing the studies, because there's always more research to be done, and there's only so much research that has been done, because a lot of research has only started to be done in the 2000s, so there aren't many recent studies and more that can be done, and there aren't many historical studies. And it's juvenile justice, as we saw, it was the late 19th century, is a newer thing. And then increased community support, that kind of ties in with diversion programs and that, and it's basically that a supporting community who wants rehabilitation and supports it, it's more likely to things like that to happen, and for bills and stuff to pass, and for funding to work. And this involves youth courts, and that every sort of local area should have a youth court that can individually try juveniles, and the judge can look at them as juveniles rather than adults, and there's a sort of separation there so they can be treated as their own special thing because they are developing and they're special. And for the implications in future research, the implications have shown the importance of continuing juvenile justice reform, because you don't want it to repeat and to go back into a hardcore mode, and there's more reform that can be done. There's only so many levels. The one talks about how they're finally in Ohio starting to shut down some juvenile prisons. So you can see this is a constantly being worked on thing, and it shouldn't be stopped. It shouldn't be halted, and we don't want to make progress backwards either. So there are many things that can be done. And again, pushing for rehabilitation over incarceration, the big point. And then future research, more research to be done on the impacts of certain diversion programs, certain community service actions, the amount of time, maybe a support for like a public transport system to help the youth go to these things because they don't have a car and their parents are working jobs and they can't do it. So there are so many more studies that can be done to measure the adequacy of these things. And then research on recidivism is a big one because you want to know if you are doing these diversion programs and community services, are they effective? And the research has shown in many cases they are effective, and sometimes they aren't. In many the cases tend to be low, and recidivism tends to occur for more serious crimes, and the less serious the crime, the less recidivism there is if it is implemented with a community service program and diversion programs to help the person. And so in the end, I would say the important thing to remember is rehabilitation over incarceration in juvenile justice, along with the importance of community service and how effective those things are at helping stop recidivism in juvenile justice.